I want you to think about the first time you were exposed to D&D in media. Take a second to think. For most of you, that was Stranger Things, Critical Role, or Dimension 20. Now think about what you saw. People sitting around a table, rolling dice, and moving around miniatures. Miniatures! They seem so fundamental to the experience. But here's the thing. They're not. When I started playing D&D, my group didn't use miniatures. We used our imagination. Theater of the mind or miniatures. Which is better for your tabletop RPG games? Theater of the mind just means combat in which you're not using miniatures. All the action is taking place in the heads of you and your party. I think this style has some pros and some cons. Like, the biggest pro, in my opinion, is that players are more creative. Sometimes having a physical map in miniatures limits the creativity of players. Why is this? Well, because you feel locked into what's around you when it's on a map. Whether it be a physical map or actual terrain, players, when they look at a map and they look at actual minis, they think that is exactly what is there and nothing else. But if you've ever tried to make a map as a dungeon master or really a game master for any system, you know that a physical map is just a translation of the real thing that you had in your head. It's not a one-to-one copy. Maybe you imagine that you're fighting in a ballroom with chandeliers hanging from the ceilings, but you don't have mini chandeliers to use as miniatures. When a map is out, players forget about the chandeliers hanging above them. But in Theater of the Mind, when everything is being imagined, players take in those elements more. Because really, it's no different than what they're already doing. They can't be using their eyes to see what the battlefield is. They have to be imagining everything. In my personal experience, I've seen players act far more creatively in Theater of the Mind combats than in actual miniature-based combats. Additionally, not only are players more creative, but I've found that they take their turns faster. Theater of the Mind combat isn't about specifics, because it can't be. You're imagining everything, so exact distances, they just don't work. But that also means you're removing the time for players to actually measure out how far they can move. Players stop worrying about exact positioning, so things go faster. And I will also say that's true for the Dungeon Master as well. Now, this can be seen as a weakness for some, because you aren't worrying about exact distances. Nobody is measuring exact distances, so if you, as a player, care about exactly how far away something is, or exact positioning of enemies, Theater of the Mind will fail you. If you care about little details like a dwarf can only move 25 feet, or the exact radius of a fireball matters to you, well, that's going to be really tough to keep up with. But in exchange, you're also getting more creative environments. When you're running Theater of the Mind, as a DM, you are limited only by your imagination. If you and your table can imagine it, a combat can happen there. And unless you're a professional artist, you're going to have creative limitations on what your maps can be. But Theater of the Mind does have a mechanical limitation. You can only have so many enemies. In my experience, anything more than 3 different enemies in a Theater of the Mind combat just becomes a nightmare. You are both freed by your descriptive ability and limited by it. You and your players have to keep track of the enemies in your mind. For this reason, large combats are fucked. You're just not going to be able to run wide-ranging combats with tons of different enemies. But if that's not a concern of yours, then you're a-okay. So that's the case for Theater of the Mind. What do you need to know about miniatures? Well, I think the number one thing about miniatures is that they just look cool. There are a few better feelings than having a really cool new miniature that you get to plop down in front of your players and they're just ogling at how amazing it looks. Because while it doesn't have the grandeur of your imagination, it does have the real physical tangibility that is combined with the skill of actually painting the miniature. And I consider the painting of miniatures a benefit in and of itself. Building and painting miniatures and subsequent terrain can be fun. Many find it therapeutic. And really, game masters engage with the hobby in their own ways. Writers like to write lore. Artists might draw characters and scenes. And if you like painting minis and building them, well, you can do that in your free time when you're not sitting down at the gaming table. And when you do sit down at the gaming table, there are a ton of benefits for having those miniatures there. Most of those benefits revolve around tactical play. You know where everything is at all times. You know the exact distances of everything, which is important because if you're walking through something like, I don't know, a dungeon, you want to know if you're 5 feet away from the tripwire or 15 feet away from the tripwire. Miniatures allow for precise movement, because you can see exactly how far you're going. Since systems like D&D and Pathfinder have such crunchy and robust rules that revolve around exact distances, uniform distances, knowing exact information can be invaluable if you're trying to run a tactical combat. But really, any TTRPG becomes more tactical when you introduce miniatures. And because the game becomes more tactical, you can run larger and larger combats. Since players don't need to keep track of every single enemy in their minds, you can place more enemies in combat. All it takes is a look for players to understand what's going on. And really, that's another benefit, players getting a rock-solid view of the battlefield, because some players want to have a definitive picture of what their battle space looks like. They want to know exactly where all enemies are so they can make the optimal play. But miniatures aren't all sunshine and rainbows because they have a lot of drawbacks. One of them, admittedly, is money. Miniatures and terrain are not free. You can get away with just miniatures in many situations, but again, they still cost money that some GMs just do not have. Buying, building, and painting miniatures can be an expensive hobby. My Warhammer 40k players, I know you're out there and you understand. Now, there is a counterpoint here, which is that you can just use proxies. This is an option if you're on a budget, and there are many different proxy types. You can have paper proxies, you can have gummy bear proxies that you eat once you kill an enemy. But with many proxies, you are still drifting more towards the abstract and theater of the mind. And you're losing out on the side hobby of miniatures in terrain. And another meta point about these miniatures is that you throw away a lot of prep when you use miniatures. Every DM knows the pain of prepping an encounter and your players never touch it. That pain becomes 10 times worse when it's an encounter where you have painted a custom miniature for, when you've gotten the terrain map settled in just right, and players completely bypass it. And I can tell you from experience that just really sucks. I'm able to laugh about it now, but it is a real drawback with miniatures. In Theater of the Mind, all you're losing is your thoughts, and those are cheap. With miniatures, you're beginning to lose your time, which is the most important thing you have as a dungeon master. Now, there is a third option that you can use, and this is one that I tend to gravitate more towards. I like to call this approach miniature minimalism. Maps are just grids with lines on them that show where the edges of a map are or where any big pieces of terrain are located. I'll doodle in places like chasms where players cannot go, but things like columns, tables, and the like are not drawn. Resist the urge for detail. Players and enemies are represented in the form of tokens. More well-used tokens have actual pictures of player characters on them, but enemy tokens basically just approximate size. I like to use chess pieces for enemies because that's a good meta level of detail. Intuitively, players know that creatures that are pawns are less dangerous than like a rook or a queen. And when the BBEG of an adventure, the king, gets thrown down on the board, well, now everything is heightened. It's the low cost of Theater of the Mind and the abstractness that leads to player creativity, while also allowing you to have more tactical combats and know exactly where everything is. But really, at the end of the day, whether you use miniatures or Theater of the Mind, that doesn't make you a great dungeon master. This thing does. So if you want to know more, watch this video, and thank you for entering the dungeon.